But first is Osborne's austerity, like a badger coal trial that's failed and best confined to the dustbin? Well, I think Andrew Fisher might agree with that, because he's a former parliamentary researcher who's written a book called The Failed Experiment, and I'm hoping very much that he's joining us on the line now. Andrew, are you there?
I am. Hi. Good to be on the show, Tony.
OK, Andrew, could you just tell us a bit about yourself? You were doing a bit of parliamentary research, and I imagine you've got a bit of studying under your belt. I've got an MA, if we're going to be boastful about that sort of thing. I then went to work in Parliament for a charity for a couple of years before that as a researcher. I now work for one of the biggest trade unions in the country as a policy officer. So I've had an interest in the economy and politics, obviously, for a long time. So, yeah, and I've just written a book. It's, as you said, called The Failed Experiment, which is about the economic consensus that has dominated British politics for the entirety of my lifetime, I'm afraid to say, probably since the late 70s. So in it, I sort of argue why that consensus needs to be abandoned now. And I think it's obviously quite an urgent thing, because what we've seen since the crash is actually it's come back. It's that consensus has re-emerged and indeed sustained throughout the crisis.
Well, we call it the crash, don't we? But actually what was happening there was, at least what we're being told, was that the crash was being avoided, and that what we were doing was trying to stop actual crash happening. Can you just go back to 2008 and give us your take on what happened then? Because I was very, very disturbed the other week to hear that the Bank of England have shredded all their records in the run-up to that. It just sounds to me like criminals covering their tracks.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's remarkable about that period is there was a huge amount of political consensus established itself very quickly. I mean, I think for most people in Britain, the crisis didn't really occur until the Northern Rock collapse. And, you know, there were people queuing around the block in late 2007, and that's when people thought, wait a minute, this is something unusual. I mean, indeed, it hadn't happened since the middle of the 19th century in Britain before. So people sort of woke up to that, but very quickly politicians panicked initially, because I don't think they understood what was happening, either on this side of the Atlantic or in the US. But very quickly there was a consensus re-established. Firstly, we must bail out the banks. And you know, people talk about we've taken them into public ownership, we nationalised the banks. We didn't really. We privatised public money to bail out the banks. That's what happened. You know, we don't really own the banks or control them. I mean, look at what's happened with RBS this week. They've announced the sacking of another set of thousands of staff, closure of branches. You know, that's not in the public interest, and yet it's 83% publicly owned. Then there was quantitative easing. No real debate about that. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It was just a consensus. You know, the Bank of England must effectively print money in order to sustain the banking sector and you know, refloat it in a sense. And then since then we've had the consensus that austerity's got to happen. There's got to be huge cuts in public spending to pay for the crisis. And there's again very little debate, or debate within very tight confines, you know, a few percentage points here and there between the main political parties about what should happen. And I think there needs to be a clearer understanding about what actually happened in 2007-8, and then actually a re-evaluation of what we should have done about it instead.
How do these consensuses get formed, if you can use that word? Because it sounds to me like a load of people turning up at a meeting, maybe a press conference or whatever, having had a chat down the pub beforehand first and really decided what they're going to say, what they're going to do, and yet what they're doing is they're spending massive amounts of public money. The best place to decide how that's happened is through some sort of democratic process, not with a few mates in a bar in the city.
I agree entirely. I think what happened initially, I think if you look at the parliamentary debates at the time, there's very few MPs actually engaged with it. If you listen, you know, you look at the Hansard records now of the debates or watch it on Parliament TV, very few MPs are actually engaged with this, because actually I think, like, to be frank, a lot of the bankers and a lot of the regulators, they didn't understand what was going on. I don't think most... I didn't before this, so I'll be honest here. I didn't know what a collateralised debt obligation was. I didn't know what a credit default swap was until the crash started happening. I looked it up and I got into it pretty quickly after that. But, you know, these sort of things that were happening, our MPs didn't have a clue about it. So there was a large degree of politicians being reliant on others for information. And where did they go to for that information? Well, we saw it with who did the government immediately get to advise them on what to do about Northern Rock.
It was the investment banks. That was who was drafted in to advise them. So this consensus happened, I think, partially due to ignorance, is the more benign view, but also because there just wasn't any other political alternative, and hadn't been for a generation really, to the market. The market knows best. Labour put off nationalising Northern Rock for as long as possible. Remember, it was a Labour government then. Alistair Darling was the Chancellor, Gordon Brown Prime Minister. And they put it off for as long as possible. They spent £100 million of taxpayers' money trying to do anything to prop up Northern Rock and the rest of the banking system without having to go for the, in inverted commas, nationalisation option. And so I just think there wasn't really the consciousness, the political awareness that there is some other option than just throwing money at these things to bail them out.
I suppose the obvious thing to ask you now, Andrew, is if you'd have had the ear of the Chancellor at the time, Alistair Darling, what would you have been saying to him? Hang on, here's a plan B for you, that he could have then gone about building his own consensus around, which would have been working in the public interest rather than in the private bankers' interest, because that's clearly who that consensus was working for, having massive amounts of public money poured into the banks with no guarantee of it ever coming back.
Well, I think we have to start from one thing they did get right, is that they did actually have to bail it out. I mean, when you look at the banks, they hold our savings, they hold our pensions, the wider finance sector, our saving, our wages are paid into our bank accounts, our bills are paid through them. You can't just let all that collapse overnight. The government had to step in. But what it should have done is nationalised it, and by that I mean taken control, not given it public money, which is...
Well, effectively, sorry to interrupt, Andrew, but effectively, surely that's what we've done. It's just that we haven't actually exercised that control as shareholders in making decisions about hiring and firing on bank boards, and actually placing people who we know and trust are going to be working in the public interest on those boards.
Well, exactly, and that's what should have happened. So it may sound like a fairly minor difference, but actually, if you're acting in the public interest, which, it's maybe a naive view, but that's what I think, and that's what I think most people think governments should do, is act in the public interest. That's what would have happened. We would have had banks that acted in the public interest.
And could we still do that?
Of course. I mean, we own 83% of RBS. And it's interesting, if you go back to the Treasury Select Committee at the time, they held an inquiry into the Northern Rock bailout and public ownership, effectively, that happened. And the chief executive, or the head of the CBI, I forget his exact title, I think Director General they call them, of the CBI, said very clearly we wouldn't want a public sector bank that could offer better terms to customers. It would be uncompetitive. And what he meant by that very clearly is that if you have a public sector bank, it can borrow more cheaply, it can give better interest rates to savers, offer lower rates to borrowers, and it can act in the public interest. It can make sure the evictions that happened of Northern Rock customers, massive amount of defaults on mortgages and repossessions, that didn't have to happen. And the rest of the banking sector was absolutely terrified that Labour would suddenly, rip off its Tory blue shirt that it had on for the last 20 years and become a Labour government again, that nationalise things and ran things in the public interest. And so they were very clear, this cannot happen. This cannot happen. It would be uncompetitive. And what he meant by that, it would offer a better deal to customers and might damage the rest of the private sector banks.
So we can see where their priorities lie. But what about the situation we're in now is that a lot of the figures are indicating a turnaround in the run-up to the next general election. The austerity plans, many people are saying, I'm afraid, against what you're saying here, austerity has worked. The economy is now starting to pick up again and it's going to be actually in quite good shape, ready for next year's general election.
I'd say, what are we measuring? If you want to look at GDP, then yes, the figures have picked up. It's finally, after 5 years of stagnation, we finally got a modest bit of growth, and that that's not to be dismissed, but it's not good. If you look at what the Institute for Fiscal Studies is saying, it's saying that actually the average household is £1,500 worse off today than they were before the crash. Now that to me isn't a recovery.
if you look at unemployment, it's still high by historical standards. It's about 2.3 million at the moment. On top of that, you've got about nearly 1.5 million people who are in part-time work who want a full-time job. You've got about 800,000 people who are in temporary work who want a permanent job, a secure contract for a job. And you've got several others who are being hidden through a variety of sanctions and workfare and other, punitive welfare measures. There has been no recovery for the majority of people in this country. We've seen the cost of living crisis, which is, perhaps not the catchiest phrase, but it's a point Labour, to its credit, has banged on about, is real. Rail fares are going up well above inflation, electricity and gas prices going up well above inflation.
Second-class postage stamps going up. I was just talking about earlier on, by nearly 50%. The second-class postage stamp has gone up over the last 2 years.
Absolutely, and people's wages aren't rising to meet those costs. We are becoming worse off, and our economy isn't creating the sort of well-paid, skilled jobs that actually Britain, as a workforce, is qualified to do. So people are wasting their talents in, fairly low-grade, low-paid jobs that really aren't exploiting or utilising would be a better word, the skills of this country. So there's absolutely no recovery. And if you look at Osborne's projections in the budget, where he says, growth will be 2.7% this year and 2.3% next year, they're all based on rising household debt. Exactly what got us into this mess.
In the first place, yeah, quite right. Also, I agree with you. I'm not sure I like this cost of living crisis phrase. Maybe the pound in your pocket, they used to call it, I think, back when I were a lad. But I suppose essentially it's about having a disposable income shrinking, and actually a negative disposable income. And we've all heard all about this. Many people have heard it, many people have felt it, many people have seen it when it comes to paying their bills. But ultimately, you as someone who's got your head around this, we hope, what's the way of the most effective, efficient, quickest, simplest way of getting around this, so that we can start to actually push back and find that we've got a little bit more than we need every week rather than a little bit less? Because that's actually what it's all about, being able to pay the bills and have a decent quality of life with a few pennies in our pocket. We had a report from The Independent last week saying people have got a really bad quality of life. They can't afford to do simple things like go to the pub and go out to the cinema, for